When a heavily pregnant woman collapses on a lonely Kansas homesteader's porch in 1867, bruised and abandoned by society, he faces an impossible choice that will determine both their fates. But when his disapproving family arrives with ultimatums that threaten to destroy everything they've built together, will James risk losing his inheritance and reputation to protect the woman who's captured his heart? The screaming wind cut across the Kansas prairie like a knife, carrying dust and the promise of winter storms. Lydia Hartwell stumbled through the tall grass, her bare feet bleeding from sharp stones and thorns. Each step sent fire up her legs, but she kept moving because stopping meant giving up, and she wasn't ready to die yet. Her belly was so big she could barely see her feet. The baby inside kicked and twisted, making her gasp with pain. She pressed both hands against her stomach and whispered, "Just a little farther, little one. We're going to find somewhere safe." The October sun blazed overhead, making sweat drip down her face even though the wind was cold. Her blue dress was torn in 3 places and covered with mud from the creek she'd crossed that morning. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, and her mouth felt like sand. Everything hurt. Her back ached like someone was hitting it with a hammer. Her legs shook with each step. But the worst pain was in her heart, where the memory of her family's angry words still burned like hot coals. "Get out!" her father had shouted, his face red with shame. "No daughter of mine will bring this disgrace to our family name." Her mother had cried, but she hadn't stopped him from throwing Lydia's few belongings into the dirt. "You made your choice," she'd whispered. "Now live with it." That was 3 days ago. 3 days of walking across empty land, sleeping under bushes, drinking from muddy streams. 3 days of wondering if she would die out here with her baby, forgotten by everyone who had once claimed to love her. Through the shimmering heat, something appeared on the horizon. At first, Lydia thought it was just another mirage, like the lake that had fooled her yesterday morning. But as she got closer, she could see it was real. A small wooden cabin with smoke coming from the chimney. Her heart jumped with hope and fear. Hope because it meant people, maybe food, maybe help. Fear because people had stopped being kind to her the day her condition became obvious to everyone in town. The cabin was simple but well-built, with a front porch and glass windows that caught the sunlight. A vegetable garden grew beside it, with pumpkins and late corn still growing strong. Someone lived here. Someone who took care of things. Lydia's legs started shaking harder as she walked up the dirt path to the front door. What would she say? How could she explain why a pregnant woman with no wedding ring was wandering alone across the prairie? The porch steps looked as tall as mountains. She grabbed the wooden railing and pulled herself up the first step. Her vision started going black around the edges, but she forced herself to take the second step. On the third step, her knees gave out. The world spun sideways as she fell forward, her shoulder hitting the rough wooden door with a loud thud. The last thing she saw before everything went dark was a pair of worn leather boots running toward her. When she opened her eyes again, strong arms were lifting her up. A man's voice, deep and worried, was saying something she couldn't quite understand. She tried to speak, but only a whisper came out. "Please," she managed to say, "don't send me away." The man carrying her had dark hair and gentle brown eyes. His hands were careful as he pushed open the cabin door. "Nobody's sending you anywhere, ma'am. You're safe now." The inside of the cabin was cool and clean. She could smell bread baking and coffee brewing. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and sunlight streamed through checkered curtains on the windows. He set her down on a soft bed covered with a quilt that looked like it was made by loving hands. "When did you last eat something?" he asked, already moving toward the kitchen area. "I don't remember," she whispered truthfully. He came back with a cup of water and helped her sit up to drink it. The water was cool and clean, better than anything she'd tasted in days. "My name's James," he said. "James Thornfield. This is my homestead." "Lydia," she said, then stopped. Should she give her real last name? What if he knew her family? What if he'd heard the stories? "Just Lydia for now," James said, as if he understood her worry. "That's enough." He went back to the kitchen and started putting together a plate of food, bread, butter, some kind of meat, and vegetables from his garden. Her stomach growled so loud they both heard it. Easy now, he said, watching her eat. Small bites, or you'll make yourself sick. The food was the best thing she'd ever tasted. Not because it was fancy, but because it was given with kindness by someone who didn't know her story yet. Someone who looked at her like she was a person, not a problem. James watched the young woman eat like she hadn't seen food in a week, which was probably true. Her hands shook as she lifted the bread to her mouth, and he could see how thin she was everywhere except her belly, where new life was growing. He'd been living alone for 2 years, and he'd almost forgotten how it felt to have another person in his cabin. The sound of someone else breathing, the rustle of skirts, the grateful little sounds she made as she ate, it made the place feel alive again. Better? He asked when she'd finished half the plate. She nodded, her eyes filling with tears. I can't pay you for this. I don't have any money. Did I ask for money? James sat down in the chair across from her. Out here we help each other. That's how people survive. She looked around the cabin, taking in the handmade furniture, the books on the shelf, the half-finished rocking chair by the window. You built all this yourself? Most of it. Been working this land for 2 years now, ever since I left Illinois. He followed her gaze to the rocking chair. That one's been giving me trouble. Can't get the runners quite right. My grandfather made furniture, she said quietly. He taught me to sand and polish when I was little. Something in her voice told James there was pain connected to that memory, like most of her memories probably were. He'd seen that look before, in animals that had been hurt by humans but still hoped for kindness. How far have you walked? He asked. I don't know. 3 days, maybe 4. I lost track. She touched her belly absently. We just kept going until we couldn't go anymore. The way she said we, including the unborn child, made something tight in James's chest. This woman was protecting her baby the only way she knew how, with nothing but her own 2 feet and stubborn courage. Where were you headed? Anywhere but where I was. The bitterness in her voice was sharp as a knife. I thought maybe California or Oregon. Somewhere nobody knows my name. James nodded. He understood running from the past. That's why he was here too, though his reasons were different from hers. Well, you're welcome to rest here as long as you need, until you figure out your next step. She stared at him like he'd spoken in a foreign language. Just like that? You don't even know who I am. I know you're brave enough to walk across Kansas alone to protect your child. I know you're polite and grateful and you don't take kindness for granted. He shrugged. That tells me more about your character than any story about your past would. For a moment, she looked like she might cry again. Then she straightened her shoulders in a way that reminded James of his mother when she was determined to be strong. The baby isn't my husband's, she said, the words coming out in a rush. I'm not married. Never was. That's why my family threw me out. James had already guessed as much, but he kept his expression calm. And the father? Gone. Married someone else. Someone whose family had money and a good name. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. I was foolish enough to believe him when he said he loved me. His loss, James said simply. She blinked in surprise. Most people would say I was the foolish one, that I got what I deserved. Most people have never been alone and scared and desperate enough to believe in love when it was offered. James stood up and moved to the stove, giving her space to think. Besides, seems to me the one who ran away instead of taking responsibility is the real fool in this story. He started making coffee, the familiar motions giving his hands something to do while his mind worked. This woman, Lydia, was in trouble deeper than just being tired and hungry. She was carrying shame that didn't belong to her, running from people who should have protected her. How long until the baby comes? He asked. The midwife said late November, maybe early December. She touched her belly again. I can feel him getting stronger. Or her. I don't know which. Either way, traveling won't be safe much longer. Especially not alone. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions and possibilities. James could see her wrestling with something, pride, maybe, or fear of trusting again. I won't be a burden, she said finally. I can cook and clean and help with the animals. I'm stronger than I look. I'm sure you are. James poured 2 cups of coffee and brought one to her. But that's not why I'm offering. I'm offering because it's the right thing to do. And because... He paused, surprised by his own honesty. Because this place has been mighty quiet for 2 years. Might be nice to have someone to talk to besides my horse. That got a small smile from her, the first real smile he'd seen. It changed her whole face, making her look younger and less worn down by the world. What's your horse's name? Thunder. He's got opinions about everything, but he's not much for conversation. This time she actually laughed, a sound like music in the quiet cabin. James felt something warm spread through his chest, something he hadn't felt since he'd left Illinois and the wreckage of his own broken dreams behind. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the windows and promising a cold night ahead. But inside the cabin, for the first time in years, James felt like he might not be alone anymore. Thunder's hooves pounded against the frozen ground as James raced toward the cabin, his heart hammering with panic. Smoke was pouring from the kitchen window, too much smoke, the wrong color smoke. Something was burning that shouldn't be burning. He'd only been gone an hour, checking the fence line where coyotes had been testing his defenses. But an hour was long enough for disaster to strike, especially when Lydia had been having those sharp pains all morning. "Lydia!" he shouted, throwing himself off Thunder before the horse had fully stopped. "Lydia, where are you?" No answer came from inside the cabin. The front door hung open, banging in the November wind. James burst through, coughing as smoke filled his lungs. The kitchen was a mess, flour scattered across the floor, a pot of something black and ruined on the stove. Bread dough spread everywhere like someone had tried to make dinner and lost a fight with it. "Lydia!" He found her in the back room, doubled over on the bed, her face white as snow. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "The baby?" she gasped, gripping his arm so hard her nails dug through his shirt. "Something's wrong. The pains started right after you left, and they won't stop." James felt his mouth go dry. It was too early, at least 3 weeks too early. Out here, with no doctor within 50 miles and winter storms already starting. A baby coming early could mean death for both mother and child. "How bad is the pain?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm while his mind raced through options. "Like someone's tearing me apart from the inside." Tears streamed down her face. "James, I'm scared. What if something happens to the baby? What if I can't do this?" Another pain hit her, so strong she couldn't speak, just gripped his hand and held on like he was the only thing keeping her from drowning. James had helped birth foals and calves, but this was different. This was Lydia, and the thought of losing her made his chest feel like it was caving in. "Listen to me," he said, brushing her hair back from her sweaty forehead. "You're the strongest person I know. You walked across half of Kansas to protect this baby. You can do this." But even as he said the words, doubt gnawed at him. Mrs. Patterson, their nearest neighbor, was 20 miles away through country that was already getting dangerous with early ice. The baby wasn't supposed to come for weeks, and Lydia looked so small and fragile lying there, fighting a battle he couldn't fight for her. "I need to get Mrs. Patterson," he said, starting to stand. "No!" Lydia grabbed his shirt, panic in her eyes. "Don't leave me alone. Please. What if the baby comes while you're gone?" James looked out the window at the darkening sky. Snow was already starting to fall, tiny flakes that would turn into a blizzard by nightfall. Going for help might mean leaving Lydia to face this alone, but staying might mean watching her and the baby die because he didn't know enough to save them. "The pains," he said carefully. "How far apart are they?" "I don't know. 10 minutes? 5? They keep getting closer together." That decided it. There wasn't time to go for help, even if the weather allowed it. James was all she had, and she was all he had. They would face this together, like they'd faced everything else since she'd collapsed on his porch. "All right," he said, rolling up his sleeves. "We're going to do this ourselves. First, let me get some water boiling and gather clean cloths." As he worked, moving between the kitchen and bedroom, James tried to remember everything his mother had told him about birthing babies. Keep everything clean. Make sure the mother stays warm. Don't panic, even when everything seems to be going wrong. Tell me about your grandfather, he said, trying to distract her as another pain gripped her. The one who made furniture. He was... Oh God, here comes another one. She breathed hard through the pain, then continued in a shaky voice. He was the kindest man I ever knew. Used to let me sit in his workshop and watch him work. Said I had good hands for woodworking. What happened to him? Died when I was 12. After that, my parents said woodworking wasn't proper for a lady. Said I needed to focus on finding a husband and keeping house. Her laugh was bitter. Look how well that worked out. James set a bowl of warm water beside the bed and sat down next to her. Maybe this baby will love woodworking too. Maybe we can teach him together. Him. Despite her pain, Lydia managed a small smile. What makes you think it's a boy? Just a feeling. A boy who'll grow up knowing how to use his hands to build things instead of tear them down. James took her hand again. A boy who'll be proud of his mother's courage. The pain hit again, stronger this time, and Lydia cried out. But when it passed, she looked at James with something new in her eyes. Not just fear and pain, but hope. You really think we can do this? She whispered. I know we can, James said, and for the first time since he'd seen the smoke, he actually believed it. Outside, the wind howled and snow began to pile against the windows. But inside the small cabin, two people who had found each other in their darkest moments prepared to bring new life into the world, armed with nothing but determination and love. The next pain came faster than expected, and Lydia's scream echoed through the night, mixing with the storm's fury as nature and humanity fought their own separate battles for survival. The letter lay on the kitchen table like a coiled snake, its elegant handwriting spelling out words that could destroy everything James and Lydia had built together. Daniel Thornfield's formal script announced his arrival in just 5 days, bringing his wife Margaret and their 2 children to assess James's situation and discuss family matters of utmost importance. Lydia stood by the window, baby Hope sleeping peacefully in her arms, watching James pace back and forth across the cabin floor like a caged animal. 3 months had passed since Hope's dramatic entry into the world during that terrifying November storm, and those months had been the happiest of Lydia's life. Now, with 4 simple sentences on expensive paper, their peaceful world was about to be shattered. He knows, James said, running his hands through his hair. Somehow, Daniel knows about you and Hope, about us. How could he know? Lydia asked, though her stomach was already twisting with dread. We haven't told anyone. The only people who've seen us are the traveling preacher and Mrs. Patterson. James stopped pacing and stared at the letter. Mrs. Patterson goes to town every month for supplies. She talks to the storekeeper, he talks to the mail carrier talks to everyone between here and Illinois. He shook his head grimly. News travels fast out here, especially when it's the kind of news people love to whisper about. Hope stirred in Lydia's arms, making the tiny mewing sounds that meant she was waking up hungry. Lydia looked down at her daughter's perfect little face, the dark eyes that were so much like James's, even though he wasn't her real father, the rosebud mouth that smiled every time she heard his voice. What will you tell them? She asked quietly. The truth. James's voice was firm, but Lydia could see the worry in his eyes. That you're my wife in every way that matters. That Hope is my daughter, and this is our family. But they both knew it wasn't that simple. In the eyes of the law, in the eyes of society, Lydia was still an unmarried mother living in sin with a man who wasn't her child's father. The traveling preacher who'd been through last month had offered to marry them, but a winter storm had forced him to leave before the ceremony could take place. Your brother could cause real trouble for us, Lydia said, remembering the stories James had told her about Daniel's rigid sense of propriety and social standing. He could tell people we're not really married. He could make sure everyone knows about my past. Let him try. James's jaw was set in a way that reminded Lydia of thunder when the horse was determined to have his way. This is my land, my home. Daniel has no power here. But even as he spoke the words, they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Daniel Thornfield was a successful businessman with connections and influence. He could make life very difficult for a struggling homesteader and the woman he was protecting, especially if he decided their arrangement was a threat to the family's reputation. Hope began to fuss, and Lydia automatically started the gentle swaying motion that always calmed her. "Maybe I should leave," she said, hating the words even as she spoke them. "Take Hope and go somewhere else before your family arrives. It would be easier for everyone." "No." The word came out sharper than James intended, and Hope startled in her mother's arms. He lowered his voice, but his eyes blazed with determination. "You're not running anymore, Lydia. We've talked about this. This is your home now. But if staying here hurts you, the only thing that would hurt me is watching you disappear again." James moved to stand beside her at the window, his hand gentle on Hope's tiny head. "We've built something good here, something real. I won't let my brother's narrow-minded ideas destroy that." Outside, the February sky was gray and heavy with the promise of more snow. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and harsh and unforgiving. It was a land that demanded strength from those who chose to make it home, and it had made James and Lydia stronger than either of them had ever imagined they could be. "What's he like?" Lydia asked. "Your brother." James was quiet for a moment, thinking, "Daniel's not a bad man exactly. He sees the world in very black and white terms. Right and wrong, proper and improper, respectable and scandalous. He's never had to make the kind of choices we've made. And his wife, Margaret's even worse. She grew up in Boston society, where reputation is everything and appearances matter more than truth." James's expression darkened. "She'll take one look at you and Hope and see only shame and disgrace." Lydia felt a familiar stab of the old pain, the shame that had followed her across Kansas and nearly destroyed her spirit. But this time something was different. This time, she had James beside her, and Hope in her arms, and a home they'd built together with love and hard work. "Let them come," she said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "Let them see what we've built here. Let them try to tell us it's wrong." James looked at her with something like amazement. "You've changed," he said softly. "When you first got here, you were so broken, so convinced you were worthless. Now look at you." Lydia smiled, feeling the truth of his words settle into her bones. "I had good teachers," she said. "The prairie taught me I was stronger than I thought. Hope taught me I was worth fighting for. And you," she paused, looking into his eyes. "You taught me that love isn't about being perfect. It's about being brave enough to build something beautiful together, even when the whole world says it's impossible." Hope chose that moment to open her eyes and look up at them both, her tiny hand reaching toward James's face with complete trust. James caught her fingers in his own, marveling as he always did at how something so small could be so perfect. "5 days, he said, his voice steady with resolve. 5 days to prepare for whatever Daniel and Margaret think they can throw at us. 5 days to show them that family isn't just about blood and law and social approval," Lydia added. "It's about choosing to love and protect each other, no matter what." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them that winter wasn't finished with Kansas yet. But inside their warm cabin, 3 people who had found each other against all odds prepared to face whatever storm was coming their way. The sound of approaching horses shattered the peaceful morning like gunshots across the prairie. James dropped his axe and rushed to the window, his heart sinking as he counted 4 riders and a fancy wagon making their way up the dirt path to his cabin. Daniel had arrived a day early, probably hoping to catch them unprepared. "They're here," he called to Lydia, who was nursing Hope by the fireplace. "And they brought more people than expected." Lydia's face went pale, but she kept her voice steady. "How do I look?" James turned to study her hair neatly braided, wearing her best dress, the only one without patches. Hope content and quiet in her arms. "You look like exactly what you are. A strong woman taking care of her family." But as the wagon drew closer, James could see this wasn't going to be the simple family visit he'd hoped for. Daniel sat stiffly beside a woman who could only be Margaret, both dressed in expensive traveling clothes that screamed city money and social importance. Behind them rode two men James didn't recognize, one wearing a badge that caught the morning sunlight, the other carrying a leather satchel that marked him as some kind of official. "Why would Daniel bring a sheriff?" Lydia whispered, moving closer to the window. James felt ice forming in his stomach. "I don't know, but it can't be good." The wagon stopped in front of the cabin, and Daniel climbed down with the formal movements of a man conducting business rather than visiting family. He was shorter than James but carried himself like someone used to being the most important person in any room. Margaret remained seated, her nose wrinkled as if the prairie air itself offended her delicate sensibilities. "James!" Daniel's voice boomed across the yard, but there was no warmth in it. "Brother, we need to talk. Immediately." James stepped onto the porch, positioning himself between his family and the visitors. "Daniel, Margaret, this is unexpected. I thought you were coming tomorrow. Plans changed when we received some very disturbing information." Daniel's eyes found Lydia through the window, and his expression hardened. "Information about your living arrangements." The sheriff, a weathered man with gray whiskers, dismounted and tipped his hat politely. "Ma'am," he said to Lydia. "Sheriff Bradley from Newton. I apologize for the intrusion, but there are some questions that need answering." "Questions about what?" James demanded, stepping down from the porch to face them directly. The man with the leather satchel cleared his throat. "I'm Judge Harrison, Mr. Thornfield. I'm here because serious allegations have been made regarding the welfare of a child living in this household." Lydia's gasp was audible from inside the cabin. James felt the world tilt sideways as the implications hit him. "What kind of allegations?" Margaret finally spoke, her Boston accent cutting through the morning air like a blade. "The kind that suggest an unmarried woman of questionable morals is exposing an innocent child to an immoral living situation. The kind that require immediate intervention." "That's enough," James growled, his hands clenching into fists. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Margaret's smile was cold as winter frost. "An unwed mother, living in sin with a man who isn't the child's father, pretending to be a proper family? In civilized society, we have laws against such arrangements." Judge Harrison opened his satchel and pulled out an official-looking document. "Mr. Thornfield, I have here a petition filed by your brother, requesting that the court examine the living conditions of the infant known as Hope. There are concerns about the child's moral and physical welfare." Inside the cabin, Hope began to cry, as if she sensed the danger surrounding her small world. Lydia's voice, singing a soft lullaby, drifted through the open door. The sound was so pure and loving that even Sheriff Bradley looked uncomfortable. "You want to take my daughter away from me?" James said, his voice deadly quiet. "She's not your daughter," Daniel snapped. "That's the whole problem. You're playing house with a woman who's already proven she makes poor choices, and you're putting that child at risk. The only risk to that child is standing right here in my yard, making threats." James shot back. Sheriff Bradley held up his hands. "Now let's everyone calm down. Nobody's talking about taking any children anywhere just yet. But there are proper procedures that need to be followed." Judge Harrison nodded. "The court requires verification that this child is being raised in a stable, moral environment. If the adults in question are not legally married, if there are questions about the mother's character, then yes, the child's welfare becomes a matter of public concern." Lydia appeared in the doorway, Hope quiet now in her arms. Her face was pale but determined, and when she spoke, her voice carried across the yard with surprising strength. "My character?" she said, walking slowly down the porch steps. "You want to question my character?" Margaret's lip curled in distaste. "My dear girl, your situation speaks for itself. An illegitimate child, no husband, living unmarried with a man who owes you nothing." "He owes me nothing," Lydia agreed, her voice growing stronger with each word. "And I owe him nothing. What we have isn't built on obligation or law or what society says is proper. It's built on choice. Every single day we choose each other. We choose to work together, to support each other, to love each other and this child. She looked directly at Judge Harrison. You want to know about my character? I walked across Kansas alone and pregnant to protect my child. I've worked every day since to make a good home for her. I've never asked for charity or handouts or pity. Everything we have here we've built with our own hands. But you're not married, Margaret said, as if that single fact erased everything else. Because a traveling preacher got caught in a snowstorm, James said, moving to stand beside Lydia. We've been waiting for him to come back through so we can make it official. But a piece of paper doesn't change what we are to each other. Daniel shook his head. It changes everything in the eyes of the law, and in the eyes of God. Don't you dare lecture me about God, Lydia flared, her protective instincts overriding her fear. God gave me the strength to save my child when everyone else abandoned us. God brought me to this place, to this man, to this life we've built together. If you want to call that sinful, then your God and mine must be very different. Sheriff Bradley cleared his throat uncomfortably. Ma'am, nobody's questioning your love for the child, but there are proper ways to do things, and until those proper ways are followed, Judge Harrison interrupted. The court has a responsibility to ensure the child's welfare. I'm afraid I'll need to examine the living conditions here and interview both adults separately about their intentions and circumstances. James felt the trap closing around them. These people had come not to visit or reconcile, but to tear apart the family he and Lydia had fought so hard to build. They had legal authority, social standing, and the power to destroy everything based on nothing more than their narrow definition of respectability. But as he looked at Lydia, standing straight and proud with their daughter in her arms, he saw not the broken woman who had collapsed on his porch 6 months ago, but a warrior prepared to fight for what mattered most. Fine, he said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. Examine whatever you want. Interview us, inspect our home, question our neighbors. But when you're done, you'll see what I see every day. A woman who's the best mother that child could ever have, and a family that's built on love instead of law. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the prairie as two very different ideas of family prepared to clash, with an innocent child's future hanging in the balance. Inside the cabin, tension crackled like lightning before a storm as Judge Harrison examined every corner with the cold precision of a man who made his living judging other people's lives. Margaret followed behind him, pointing out perceived flaws with the enthusiasm of someone who had never scrubbed floors or mended clothes by candlelight. The accommodations are quite primitive, she observed, running her gloved finger along the wooden table James had built with his own hands. Hardly suitable for raising a child with proper refinement. Lydia bit back her angry response, focusing instead on Hope, who was fussing in her arms. The baby seemed to sense the hostile energy filling their normally peaceful home, and her little cries echoed off the walls like an accusation against the invaders. The child appears healthy enough, Judge Harrison admitted grudgingly, making notes in a small book. But health isn't the only consideration. There are matters of moral instruction, social development, future prospects. Future prospects? James couldn't keep the anger out of his voice. You mean the prospect of growing up loved and wanted instead of treated like a shameful secret? From outside came the sound of Sheriff Bradley questioning Mrs. Patterson, who had arrived an hour earlier in response to James's urgent message. Through the window, Lydia could see the older woman gesturing emphatically, her weather-beaten face fierce with indignation. That child has been nothing but a blessing since the day she was born, Mrs. Patterson declared loudly enough for everyone to hear. And that young woman has worked harder than any 3 city ladies I know. You want to talk about character? I'll tell you about character. Margaret sniffed dismissively. The opinions of frontier farmers hardly carry the same weight as those of educated society. Educated society? Lydia finally spoke, her voice sharp with years of suppressed anger. Is that what you call people who throw their daughters out in the street for making a mistake? People who care more about reputation than human lives? Judge Harrison looked up from his notes. Miss, I'm sorry, what exactly is your legal name? Lydia Hartwell, she answered, lifting her chin defiantly. Miss Hartwell, your situation is undeniably irregular. An unmarried mother, living without legal sanction with a man who has no blood relation to your child, in an isolated location with minimal supervision or guidance. He shook his head. Surely you can understand the court's concerns. I understand that you see scandal where there should be gratitude, Lydia replied, her voice growing stronger. This man saved my life and my daughter's life. He's given us a home, protection, love, and respect when everyone else turned their backs on us. If that's not worthy of respect, then your laws are more twisted than I thought. Daniel, who had been silent during the inspection, finally spoke. James, this madness has to stop. You're throwing away your future for what? A moment of misguided charity? Come back to Illinois with us. We can find you a proper wife, help you establish a respectable business. A proper wife? James laughed, but there was no humor in it. You mean someone whose family you approve of? Someone who comes with a dowry and social connections? Someone who's never had to fight for anything in her life? Someone who won't drag the family name through scandal and disgrace? Margaret interjected coldly. Hope's cries grew louder, and Lydia automatically began the gentle swaying motion that usually calmed her. But today, nothing seemed to work. The baby was picking up on the fear and anger that filled the cabin like smoke. Look at her, Lydia said suddenly, turning so everyone could see Hope's red, tearful face. Look at what you're doing to an innocent child. She's not a legal problem or a social embarrassment. She's a 3-month-old baby who needs love and security, not a courtroom full of strangers deciding her fate. Sheriff Bradley appeared in the doorway, his expression troubled. Ma'am, I've spoken with your neighbor, and she speaks very highly of your care for the child. But I have to ask directly, are you and Mr. Thornfield legally married? The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Lydia felt her mouth go dry, knowing that her answer could determine everything that followed. No, she said quietly. We're not. But we intend to be, James added quickly. As soon as the circuit preacher comes through again. Judge Harrison made another note. Intentions, unfortunately, don't carry legal weight. The fact remains that this child is being raised in what the law considers an immoral situation. The only immoral thing here is you people trying to destroy a loving family because it doesn't match your narrow ideas of respectability. Mrs. Patterson's voice boomed from the doorway. She'd pushed past Sheriff Bradley and now stood in the cabin like an avenging angel, her gray hair wild from the wind and her eyes blazing with fury. Mrs. Patterson, Judge Harrison began, your loyalty to your neighbors is admirable, but nothing, she interrupted. I've lived on this prairie for 15 years, and I've seen all kinds of families. Some that looked perfect from the outside but were rotten to the core, and others that society would call irregular but were filled with more love and decency than you could find in a dozen church socials. She pointed at Lydia and James. These two have built something beautiful here. That baby is loved, protected, and cared for better than half the children in families with legal papers and social approval. You want to tear that apart because some folks back east think they know better than the people who actually live this life. Margaret's face flushed with anger. This discussion is becoming quite inappropriate. The facts are simple. An unmarried woman is cohabitating with a man and exposing a child to an immoral environment. The solution is equally simple. And what solution is that? Lydia asked, though she already dreaded the answer. Judge Harrison closed his notebook with a snap. Immediate placement of the child in a stable, married household until proper arrangements can be made for her permanent care. Given the circumstances, Mr. and Mrs. Thornfield have graciously offered to take temporary custody. The words hit Lydia like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, clutching Hope tighter, her worst nightmare suddenly becoming reality. No, she whispered, then louder, no, you can't take her from me. She's my daughter. I'm her mother. A mother who chose to place herself and her child in an untenable position, Margaret said with cold satisfaction. The child deserves better than this arrangement. James stepped forward, his face dark with rage. You're not taking her anywhere. This is my land, my home, and they're my family. Get out. All of you. Sheriff Bradley's hand moved to his gun. Now, Mr. Thornfield, let's not make this harder than it has to be. The judge has legal authority here. Legal authority to steal a baby from her mother? James's voice was dangerous now, the voice of a man pushed beyond his breaking point. What kind of law is that? Hope's cries reached a crescendo, as if she understood that her world was about to be shattered. Lydia looked down at her daughter's face, seeing James's gentle eyes reflected there even though they shared no blood, seeing the trust and love that had grown between them over months of quiet moments and shared dreams. In that instant, something crystallized in Lydia's mind. These people could take her daughter, could destroy the family she'd fought so hard to build, but they couldn't take away the truth she'd discovered about herself. She was no longer the broken woman who'd collapsed on this porch. She was a mother, a fighter, and she would not go down without the battle of her life. "If you want my daughter," she said, her voice steady as stone, "you'll have to go through me first." The sound of galloping horses thundered across the prairie as a lone rider approached at breakneck speed, his black coat streaming behind him like wings. James squinted against the afternoon sun, recognizing the determined posture of Reverend Samuel Morrison even before he could make out the man's weather-beaten face. "Thank God," Mrs. Patterson breathed from beside the cabin door. "Samuel got my message." Inside the cabin, the standoff continued. Sheriff Bradley had his hand on his gun. Judge Harrison clutched his legal papers like weapons, and Lydia held hope against her chest, as if she could shield her daughter from the world's cruelty through sheer force of will. The baby had finally stopped crying, worn out from hours of tension. Her tiny fist curled around a lock of her mother's hair. Reverend Morrison dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his boots hitting the ground with purpose. He was a tall, lean man with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime spent serving frontier communities. His arrival changed the entire atmosphere of the confrontation, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "Well now," he said, brushing dust from his coat as he approached the group. "Quite a gathering we have here, though I have to say, the message I received from Mrs. Patterson suggested this was more of an emergency than a social visit." Judge Harrison straightened, clearly expecting support from a man of the cloth. "Reverend Morrison, I presume? Your timing is fortuitous. We're dealing with a situation that requires immediate moral guidance." "Are we now?" The Reverend's eyes swept over the scene, taking in the official badges, the expensive clothes, the defensive postures. "And what situation might that be? An unmarried woman living in sin with a man who isn't the father of her child," Margaret announced, as if stating a legal verdict. "We're here to remove the innocent child from this immoral environment." Reverend Morrison nodded slowly, then turned his attention to Lydia. "Miss, might I ask your name?" "Lydia Hartwell," she answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "And this beautiful child?" "Hope. Her name is Hope." The Reverend smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Hope. What a perfect name for a prairie baby." He looked at James. "And you, sir, would be the gentleman who's been providing shelter and protection for mother and child?" "James Thornfield," James replied, standing straighter. "And they're not just shelter guests, Reverend. They're my family." "Ah." Reverend Morrison rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Family. Now that's an interesting word, isn't it? Means different things to different people." Daniel stepped forward impatiently. "Reverend, surely you can see the impropriety of this arrangement. These people aren't married. They're living in flagrant violation of moral law." "Moral law?" the Reverend repeated. "Tell me, Mr. Thornfield, Daniel Thornfield, this man's brother, though I'm beginning to question our family connection. Mr. Daniel Thornfield, in your understanding of moral law, what should have happened to this young woman when she found herself with child and abandoned by the father?" The question caught Daniel off guard. "Well, she should have. There are institutions for such women, places where they can repent and give their children to suitable families." "Institutions." Reverend Morrison's voice was thoughtful. "And these institutions, in your experience, are they filled with love and care?" Do the children who grow up in them thrive and prosper? Margaret spoke up impatiently. That's hardly the point. The point is maintaining moral standards in society. I see. The Reverend turned to Sheriff Bradley. Sheriff, what exactly is the legal complaint here? Judge Harrison filed a petition regarding the welfare of the child. Sheriff Bradley explained, looking increasingly uncomfortable. Claims the living situation is harmful to the child's development. And have you observed any evidence of harm to this child? The sheriff glanced at Hope, who was sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms, her tiny chest rising and falling with perfect rhythm. Well, no. The child appears healthy and well cared for. Physically, perhaps, Judge Harrison interjected. But what about moral development? Spiritual guidance? This child is being raised to believe that unmarried cohabitation is acceptable. Reverend Morrison nodded again, then did something that surprised everyone. He walked directly to Lydia and gently touched Hope's tiny hand with one finger. She's beautiful, he said softly. How old? 3 months, Lydia answered, tears threatening to spill over. And you've been caring for her all this time? James helped, Lydia said quickly. He delivered her when she came early during a snowstorm. He saved both our lives. The Reverend looked at James with new interest. You delivered this child? Yes, sir. Mrs. Patterson was too far away to reach in the storm. It was just us. And since then, I've watched Lydia be the most devoted mother I've ever seen, James said, his voice thick with emotion. She gets up 3 times every night to feed Hope, never complains about being tired. She sings to her, reads to her, talks to her like she's the most important person in the world. Which she is, Lydia added fiercely. Reverend Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the faces around him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had seen the best and worst of human nature. Judge Harrison, you mentioned moral and spiritual guidance. Might I ask what church you attend? I attend services regularly when court business permits. And you, Mrs. Thornfield? Margaret lifted her chin proudly. First Presbyterian of Boston. My family has attended there for 3 generations. Excellent churches, I'm sure. The Reverend's gaze settled on James and Lydia. And what about you two? Do you consider yourselves people of faith? James and Lydia exchanged glances. We haven't been to formal services, James admitted. The nearest church is 50 miles away. But we pray together every evening, and we read from the Bible. We thank God for bringing us together, Lydia added, for giving us hope when we had none. Interesting. Reverend Morrison turned back to Judge Harrison. So we have 2 people who pray together daily, care for each other and their child with devotion, work hard to build an honest life, and express gratitude to God for their blessings. Tell me again why this situation is morally objectionable. Because they're not married, Margaret exclaimed. Surely even a frontier preacher can understand the importance of proper legal and religious bonds. Reverend Morrison smiled. Ma'am, I've been riding circuit in Kansas for 12 years. I've married couples in snowstorms during Indian raids and once in the middle of a prairie fire. I've learned that love and commitment are about what's in people's hearts, not what's written on paper. He reached into his coat and pulled out a worn leather book. As it happens, I came here today prepared to perform a wedding ceremony. Mrs. Patterson's message suggested it might be needed urgently. The change in the cabin's atmosphere was immediate and electric. Lydia's eyes widened with hope and disbelief, while James stepped closer to her side. Judge Harrison looked uncertain for the first time since his arrival. A wedding? Daniel's voice cracked slightly. But they haven't been properly prepared, haven't posted banns, haven't. Mr. Thornfield, Reverend Morrison interrupted gently. In frontier communities, we often dispense with some of the formalities that city churches require. What matters is the sincere intention of the couple to commit their lives to each other before God. He looked directly at James and Lydia. Is that what you want? To be married, legally and spiritually, in the sight of God and these witnesses? Yes, James said without hesitation. Yes, Lydia whispered, tears flowing freely now. Judge Harrison held up his hand. Wait just a moment. Even if they marry now, there are still questions about the irregular nature of their previous arrangement, about the child's legitimacy. Judge, Reverend Morrison's voice carried a new edge of steel. In my experience, God cares more about love and commitment than he does about legal technicalities. Are you really going to stand in the way of two people who want to make their union official? The silence stretched taut as everyone waited for Judge Harrison's response. The future of a small family hanging in the balance like tumbleweed in a Kansas wind. Hope gurgled softly in her mother's arms as Reverend Morrison opened his worn Bible, the pages fluttering in the prairie breeze that swept through the open cabin door. Sunlight streamed across the wooden floor, creating a natural altar where two people were about to pledge their lives to each other under the most unusual circumstances. Dearly beloved, the Reverend began, his voice carrying the weight of authority and compassion. We are gathered here in the sight of God and these witnesses to join James Thornfield and Lydia Hartwell in holy matrimony. Judge Harrison shifted uncomfortably, clearly wrestling with legal implications he hadn't anticipated. Sheriff Bradley had removed his hat and stood respectfully near the wall, while Mrs. Patterson beamed like she was watching her own children get married. Daniel and Margaret remained rigid with disapproval, but even they couldn't leave in the middle of a wedding ceremony without appearing completely heartless. Marriage, Reverend Morrison continued, is not merely a legal contract or a social arrangement. It is a sacred covenant between two souls who choose to walk through life together, sharing its joys and burdens, its triumphs and challenges. Lydia felt James's hand find hers, his fingers intertwining with her own in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the past months. Hope stirred slightly, then settled back into peaceful sleep, as if she too understood the importance of this moment. James, the Reverend said, turning to face him directly, do you take Lydia to be your lawfully wedded wife? Do you promise to love, honor, and cherish her, in sickness and in health, in poverty and in prosperity, for as long as you both shall live? I do, James said, his voice clear and strong. I've been promising that every day since she came into my life. Now I'm making it official. Margaret made a small sound of distress, but Daniel placed a restraining hand on her arm. Whatever his feelings about the situation, he recognized that interrupting a wedding ceremony would be beyond the pale, even for him. Lydia, Reverend Morrison continued, do you take James to be your lawfully wedded husband? Do you promise to love, honor, and cherish him, in sickness and in health, in poverty and in prosperity, for as long as you both shall live? Lydia's voice caught in her throat for a moment. 6 months ago, she had been convinced she would never trust another man, never believe in love again. Now she was standing in a simple cabin on the Kansas prairie, promising her life to the most honorable man she had ever known. I do, she said, tears streaming down her face. With all my heart, I do. The rings? Reverend Morrison asked. James reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 simple gold bands that gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. I had them made by the blacksmith in Newton, he explained to Lydia's surprised expression. I've been carrying them for weeks, waiting for the right moment. With trembling hands, they exchanged rings, each circle of gold representing an unbroken promise of love and faithfulness. Hope chose that moment to open her eyes and look up at her parents with what seemed like perfect understanding. By the power vested in me by the territory of Kansas and Almighty God, Reverend Morrison declared, I now pronounce you husband and wife. James, you may kiss your bride. The kiss was gentle and reverent, a seal on promises spoken not just in words but lived out through months of shared struggles and quiet devotion. When they separated, both were crying openly, overwhelmed by the simple joy of finally being able to call themselves a family in the eyes of both God and the law. Mrs. Patterson applauded enthusiastically, and even Sheriff Bradley smiled. Judge Harrison looked deflated, his legal arguments suddenly meaningless in the face of a legitimate marriage ceremony. Well, he said finally, closing his notebook with a snap, this does change the legal situation considerably. It changes everything, Reverend Morrison said firmly. We now have a legally married couple raising their child in a stable, loving home. I fail to see what further concerns the court might have. Daniel stepped forward, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. James, this doesn't solve anything. You're still throwing your life away on the best thing that ever happened to me. James interrupted, his arm tightening around Lydia's waist. On a woman who's stronger and braver than anyone I've ever known. On a daughter who's going to grow up knowing what real love looks like. She's not your daughter, Margaret said coldly. Yes, she is. The words came from Lydia, spoken with quiet dignity that silenced the room. She may not have his blood, but she has his love, his protection, his name, and his commitment to her future. That makes her his daughter in every way that matters. Reverend Morrison nodded approvingly. In many frontier families, children are raised by men who didn't father them but who chose to love them as their own. Love makes a family, not biology. Judge Harrison sighed heavily. Mrs. Thornfield, and I suppose I must call you that now, your marriage does resolve the legal issues I was concerned about. The child is now being raised in a stable, married household. The child has a name, James said firmly. Hope Thornfield. My daughter. And my granddaughter, Mrs. Patterson added with fierce pride. These young people have been like family to me since the day Lydia arrived. I've watched them build something beautiful together, and anyone who tries to tear that apart will answer to me. Margaret looked around the cabin with obvious disdain. This is still no place to raise a child with proper refinement. The isolation, the primitive conditions. The love, Lydia said simply. The security of knowing she's wanted and cherished. The chance to grow up strong and independent instead of worried about what other people think of her. She looked directly at Margaret, her voice growing stronger with each word. Your idea of proper refinement failed me when I needed it most. This primitive place saved my life and gave my daughter a future. I know which one I choose. Sheriff Bradley cleared his throat. Well, folks, seems like my services aren't needed here after all. Judge Harrison, if there's no legal issue remaining? Judge Harrison looked around the room one more time, taking in the obvious love between the newlyweds, the healthy, contented baby, the support of the local community represented by Mrs. Patterson and Reverend Morrison. Whatever his personal feelings about irregular situations, he was first and foremost a practical man. No, he said finally. No legal issues remaining. Mr. and Mrs. Thornfield, I wish you well in your marriage. Daniel and Margaret exchanged glances filled with defeat and frustration. They had come expecting to rescue James from what they saw as a scandalous mistake, only to find themselves witnessing a wedding that made their interference both inappropriate and futile. This isn't over, James, Daniel said as he prepared to leave. You're still throwing away your inheritance, your place in the family, your future. No, James said calmly, looking down at his wife and daughter. I'm claiming my real inheritance. I'm taking my rightful place in the only family that matters. And I'm building a future worth having. As the official party prepared to depart, Reverend Morrison lingered behind. Mrs. Thornfield, he said to Lydia, I want you to know that what you've accomplished here is remarkable. You've turned tragedy into triumph, despair into hope. That takes a special kind of courage. I had help, she said, smiling up at James. The best kind of help, the Reverend agreed. The kind that comes from someone who sees your worth when you can't see it yourself. As the sound of departing horses faded into the distance, James, Lydia, and Hope stood together in the doorway of their home, watching the Kansas prairie stretch endlessly toward the horizon. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, promising another beautiful day tomorrow. So, James said, his voice light with happiness, what do you want to do first as my wife? Lydia laughed, the sound pure and joyful. I want to finish that rocking chair you've been working on. Our daughter is going to need somewhere comfortable for her bedtime stories. Our daughter, James repeated, as if tasting the words. I like the sound of that. Hope babbled contentedly, reaching toward the evening sky with tiny hands that seemed to be grasping for stars. And in that moment, all three of them knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, They would face them together, as a family, at last. The blizzard hit Kansas like the wrath of God, burying the Thornfield homestead under 3 feet of snow and winds that howled like banshees across the frozen prairie. James pressed his face against the frost-covered window, trying to see through the white wall that had swallowed their world, his heart pounding with fear that had nothing to do with the storm outside. "The fever's getting worse," Lydia whispered from the bed, her voice cracked with exhaustion and terror. Hope lay burning hot in her arms, the baby's tiny body shaking with chills one moment and blazing with heat the next. At 6 months old, she had been the picture of health just 3 days ago, laughing and reaching for snowflakes through the window. Now she barely had the strength to cry. "We have to get her to a doctor," James said, though they both knew it was impossible. The nearest physician was in Newton, 40 miles away through country that was now completely impassable. The storm had been raging for 2 days, and the snow showed no signs of stopping. Lydia's hands trembled as she felt Hope's forehead again. "She's so hot, James. I've tried everything: cool cloths, willow bark tea, everything Mrs. Patterson taught me. Nothing's working." The baby's breathing was shallow and rapid, each tiny breath sounding like it might be her last. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her usually pink cheeks were flushed an alarming red. James had seen this kind of fever before in animals and sometimes in people. He knew how quickly it could turn deadly, especially in someone so small. "There has to be something we can do," he said, more to convince himself than Lydia. "Some medicine, some treatment." A sudden pounding on the door made them both jump. Through the howling wind came a voice calling out, barely audible over the storm's fury. "James! Lydia! Open up! It's Samuel!" James rushed to the door, fighting against the wind to pull it open. Reverend Morrison stumbled inside, covered in snow from head to toe, his horse visible behind him like a ghost in the white chaos. "Reverend!" Lydia gasped. "How did you get here in this storm?" "Mrs. Patterson sent word that Hope was sick," he said, shaking snow from his coat. "I couldn't leave a child to suffer if there was something I could do to help." James stared at him in amazement. "You rode 40 miles through a blizzard?" 37 miles, actually. But who's counting?" The Reverend moved quickly to the bed, his expression growing grave as he saw Hope's condition. "How long has she been like this?" 2 days, Lydia said, tears streaming down her face. "She just keeps getting worse. I don't know what to do." Reverend Morrison gently touched Hope's forehead, then listened to her breathing. From his saddlebags, he pulled out a small leather pouch and a bottle of clear liquid. "I'm not a doctor," he said carefully, "but I've seen this kind of fever before. In the Indian tribes I've ministered to, they use a combination of herbs that sometimes helps break the fever cycle." "Sometimes?" James asked. "It's not a guarantee," the Reverend admitted, "but it's better than doing nothing and hoping for the best." Lydia looked down at her daughter's flushed face, then back at the Reverend. "What do we need to do?" For the next hour, they worked together in desperate partnership. The Reverend brewed a tea from the herbs he'd brought, while James kept the fire burning hot and Lydia tried to get small spoonfuls of liquid into Hope's mouth. The baby fought them weakly, her tiny head turning away from the medicine. "Come on, little one," Lydia whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, Mama needs you to be strong." Outside, the storm continued its assault, rattling the windows and piling snow against the walls. Inside the cabin, 3 adults fought for the life of one small child, using faith and determination as their weapons against an enemy they couldn't see. As midnight approached, Hope's fever seemed to spike even higher. Her breathing became more labored, and she stopped responding to their voices altogether. James found himself praying harder than he ever had in his life, bargaining with God for the life of the daughter who had filled his heart with purpose. "She's not getting better," Lydia said, her voice hollow with despair. "The medicine isn't working." Reverend Morrison sat down beside the bed, his weathered hands folded in prayer. "Sometimes healing takes time," he said gently. "Sometimes all we can do is love them and trust that our love is enough. It has to be enough." James said fiercely. She's fought too hard to give up now. We all have. As if responding to her father's words, hope stirred slightly in her mother's arms. Her eyes fluttered open for just a moment, unfocused but aware, before closing again. It was the first sign of consciousness she'd shown in hours. Did you see that? Lydia breathed. She heard you, James. She knows we're here. The Reverend smiled. Children are stronger than we think. Especially children who are loved as much as this little one. They took turns throughout the night, one person always awake to watch over Hope while the others dozed fitfully in chairs by the fire. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin, something else was happening. The fever that had seemed so determined to claim their daughter was finally beginning to break. By dawn, Hope's breathing had eased, and her skin felt cooler to the touch. When the first gray light of morning filtered through the snow-covered windows, she opened her eyes and looked directly at her mother, as if to say she had no intention of going anywhere. The fever's broken, Lydia whispered, hardly daring to believe it. She's going to be all right. James collapsed into the chair beside the bed, exhaustion and relief overwhelming him. I thought we were going to lose her, he admitted. But you didn't, Reverend Morrison said, packing away his herb pouch. You fought for her and she fought back. That's what families do. As Hope began to show interest in nursing again, color returning slowly to her pale cheeks, the three adults realized they had witnessed something precious. Not just the healing of a child's body, but the strengthening of bonds that would last a lifetime. The storm outside was finally beginning to weaken, but inside the Thornfield cabin, the warmth of love and determination had proved stronger than any force nature could throw at them. 5 years had passed since that terrible winter night when Hope's fever nearly claimed her, and the Kansas prairie had become a place of abundance and joy for the Thornfield family. The morning sun streamed across their expanded homestead, illuminating fields of golden wheat that stretched toward the horizon like a sea of prosperity. Hope, now a bright-eyed 6-year-old with her mother's determined spirit and her father's gentle heart, raced through the tall grass chasing butterflies, her laughter echoing across the land like music. Her dark hair flew behind her as she ran, and her sturdy legs carried her with the confidence of a child who had never doubted her place in the world. Mama! Papa! She called, running toward the cabin where James was putting the finishing touches on a new addition. A proper schoolroom where Hope would learn her letters and numbers. Mrs. Patterson is coming, and she's got visitors. Lydia looked up from her garden, where tomatoes and corn grew in neat rows alongside the wildflowers she'd planted for their beauty alone. Her face had filled out over the years, losing the gaunt desperation that had marked her arrival, replaced by the serene confidence of a woman who knew her worth. Visitors? She asked, wiping her hands on her apron. Who would travel this far out? James set down his hammer and shaded his eyes against the morning sun. In the distance, a wagon approached with Mrs. Patterson driving and 2 figures seated beside her. As they drew closer, he could make out a well-dressed woman and a young man who looked to be about 20 years old. I don't recognize them, he said, but something about the woman's posture seemed familiar. City folk, by the look of their clothes. The wagon pulled up in front of the cabin, and Mrs. Patterson climbed down with the energy of someone half her 70 years. Lydia James Hope? She called out cheerfully. I've brought some folks who've traveled a long way to see you. The woman who stepped down from the wagon was elegantly dressed but nervous, her hands trembling as she smoothed her skirts. She appeared to be in her 50s, with graying hair and eyes that seemed to search desperately for something she wasn't sure she'd find. Lydia? She said hesitantly, her voice cracking with emotion. Lydia, is that really you? Lydia's face went white as recognition hit her like a physical blow. Mother? She whispered, hardly believing her own eyes. What are you doing here? The young man stepped forward, and Lydia gasped again. He had the same dark hair and gentle eyes she remembered from their childhood, but he was taller now, broader, no longer the boy who had tried to defend her when their father threw her out. Hello, sister, he said softly. I've missed you. Thomas? Lydia breathed, and suddenly she was running toward him, years of separation forgotten in the joy of seeing her beloved younger brother again. They embraced fiercely, both crying openly, while Hope watched with wide-eyed curiosity from behind James's legs. "I don't understand," Lydia said when she could finally speak. "How did you find me? Why are you here?" Her mother stepped forward hesitantly, as if afraid that moving too quickly might shatter the moment. "We've been looking for you for 2 years," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Ever since your father died, we've been trying to find you and to ask for your forgiveness." The words hung in the air like a bridge between past and present. James moved protectively closer to his wife, while Hope peeked out from behind him with the curiosity of a child who had never experienced family conflict. "Father's dead?" Lydia asked, her voice showing a complex mixture of emotions. Thomas nodded. "Last spring, a fever took him quickly. Before he died, he said he regretted what he'd done, that he'd been wrong to turn you away." "Too little, too late," James said quietly, but without malice. Lydia's mother looked at him for the first time, taking in his work-worn hands, his honest face, the way he stood protectively beside his wife. "You must be James," she said, "the man who saved my daughter's life." "She saved her own life," James replied. "I just gave her a place to rest while she found her strength again." Hope chose that moment to step out from behind her father, her chin raised with the fearless curiosity of a child who had been loved unconditionally from birth. "Are you my grandmother?" she asked directly. The older woman's breath caught in her throat as she looked down at the beautiful child who shared her daughter's determined spirit and her son-in-law's kind eyes. I hope I might be," she said carefully. "If your mama thinks that would be all right." Lydia knelt down beside Hope, smoothing her dark hair. "This is your grandmother, Helen," she said. "And this is your Uncle Thomas. They've come a very long way to meet you." "I have an uncle?" Hope's eyes lit up with excitement. "Does he know how to ride horses? Can he teach me to fish? Papa says I need to learn, but Mama says I'm too young." Thomas laughed, the sound breaking some of the tension in the group. "I think 6 is the perfect age to learn fishing," he said. "Maybe your papa and I can teach you together." Mrs. Patterson, who had been watching the reunion with satisfaction, clapped her hands together. "Well now," she said, "seems like this calls for a celebration. Lydia, why don't you put some coffee on while these folks get acquainted? I brought fresh honey cake from town." As they moved toward the cabin, Helen hung back, clearly struggling with something she needed to say. "Lydia," she called softly, "before we go inside, I need you to know, I tried to stop him. The day he threw you out, I tried to make him see reason. But I was too weak, too afraid to stand up to him properly. I've regretted that cowardice every day since." Lydia turned to face her mother, seeing not the cold woman who had watched her be banished, but a person who had spent years carrying her own burden of shame and regret. "We all made mistakes, Mother," she said gently. "What matters is that you're here now. Your father left the farm to Thomas and me," Helen continued. "But we want you to have your share. We want to make things right." "I don't need his money," Lydia said, gesturing toward the thriving homestead around them. "I have everything I need right here." "But Hope," Thomas interjected. "She should have the opportunity for education, for choices we never had. The inheritance could secure her future." James and Lydia exchanged glances, communicating in the wordless way of couples who had weathered storms together. Hope was chasing a grasshopper through the flowers, completely unaware that her future was being discussed. "We'll think about it," Lydia said finally. "But right now, I just want to enjoy having my family together again." As they walked into the cabin that had sheltered so many dreams and weathered so many storms, Hope skipped between her parents and her newly discovered relatives, chattering excitedly about all the things she wanted to show them. "This is where I was born," she announced proudly, pointing to the bed where she had entered the world during that long-ago blizzard. "And this is Papa's workshop where he makes furniture. And this is where Mama teaches me my letters." Helen looked around the modest but comfortable home, taking in the handmade furniture, the well-stocked shelves, the obvious love that filled every corner. This wasn't the life of desperate poverty she had imagined when she'd convinced herself that abandoning her daughter had been for the best. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. "You've built something wonderful here." "We've built it together," Lydia corrected, taking James's hand. "All of us, even the hard times, even the mistakes, they all led us to this moment." As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, filling the cabin with golden light, 3 generations of family sat around the table that James had built with his own hands. They shared stories and laughter, tears and forgiveness, slowly weaving new bonds from the threads of old wounds. Hope climbed into her mother's lap, listening with fascination to tales of Lydia's childhood, of the brother and sister who had once been as close as she and her future siblings would be. And in that moment, surrounded by the love that had rescued her from despair and the family that had finally found its way back together, Lydia realized that her greatest victory wasn't surviving what had tried to destroy her. It was creating something beautiful from the ashes of what others had called ruin. The prairie wind whispered through the wheat fields, carrying the scent of growing things and the promise of harvest. And inside the little cabin that had been a refuge for the lost and broken, hope lived and flourished, proving that love was indeed the strongest force on earth.